As entrepreneurs, we all have a reason why we chose to leave our 9 to 5 for an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I'm here to capture those stories of why we all hustle and grind for our companies. Jason Lavender is the co-founder and CEO of Electives. He began his career as an actuarial intern at Towers Perrin, eventually leading the health innovation team for North America. Jason joined Buoy to improve healthcare navigation, then moved to NextGen Ventures as a health tech expert and investor. In 2017, he founded the Players Impact, an angel investment group for professional athletes. Jason earned his MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management in 2020, where he met his future business partner Cricor and co-founded Electives, a live learning solution for lean people teams. So, Jason, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited for what you're talking about because I think we're the same person-ish. So you're in the learning industry. I've been in the learning industry for 20 years. You're in the medtech industry. My first job was for a small medtech startup in Ohio. So it sounds like a similar track. I think we're going to have a great conversation today, and I'm really looking forward to the wisdom you're going to drop.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it too. I'm sure we'll only find even more parallels as we dig in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So people heard your bio at first, but I'd like to hear a little bit let's hear about how you got started in med tech, because that's really seems like that's been your focus at this point.
Yeah. So I started my career as an actuary, actually, and I always joke the classic actuary to entrepreneur is not a story that you often hear.
It's different.
But started as an actuary at a health consulting business. It was Towers Perrin when I started. It's now Willis Towers Watson. But I spent over a decade there and just kind of got infused into the broader health and HR kind of benefits ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Pivoted kind of the career as most people do, from actuarial work to strategy consulting, and then the last few years there, I was heading up the health innovation team for North America, and that's really where I started to get that entrepreneurial itch that I don't think I realized I had at the time. And so I connected with just hundreds and hundreds of health tech entrepreneurs, got to see their passions, got to understand what they were building, why they were building. And it was really kind of playing the bridge between your startup and large Fortune 500 companies who could bring that technology to their employees. And then one of those meetings just kind of stood out more than any of the other meetings. And that was with the CEO of a company called Buoy Health, which is an AI health tech company based in Boston. Andrew, the CEO, and I started talking about a partnership, and then one thing led to another. And I ended up joining Buoy at about employee 15 or 20, something in there. And that just kind of lit even more of an entrepreneurial fire underneath me, and ended up spending 2.5+ years at Buoy while I was in business school at MIT. And being at a health tech startup during the pandemic was just like all hands on deck. Talk about, startups moving at a faster clip, but in that particular environment, it was a really fast clip, and I loved every minute of it. So I'm no longer in health tech, but I do always kind of look back at those days fondly, and always kind of look for updates in the broader health tech ecosystem.
So just kind of curious, because I know this is a transition that some people do, is they do a startup from a 9 to 5 to a startup, which is a really divergent path. I mean, it's very, very, very different world. You're used to your regular things, 5 days a week, this to your chief everything officer. And we just, with small startups. What was that transition like to you? Like, what were your first few days like in that world?
Yeah, there's a couple memories that I have quickly. So I remember totally thinking like, I'm just going to come in and like, I'm the expert. I've been in this industry for 10+ years. I'm going to be so helpful. And on day one, I was quickly humbled and realized like, I actually don't know how this, business is going to run. And so there was a couple things that stood out. I think one was just the time in terms of when I was in consulting, like we would have a meeting, 3 months down the line, and we would start preparing for it 3 months earlier. Like we would have prep sessions and at a startup, it was like the meeting's tomorrow. Like, let's figure out like what we need to do for tomorrow. So that time horizon just shrunk immediately. And then I think the other thing that at first was shocking, but I ended up loving it, was I was spoiled with how many resources I had access to in consulting. And so whether it was a physician or a pharmacist or an actuary or whoever the expert was, if I was putting together something, I could just go knock on somebody's door, get the information I needed. And at a startup, it was like just so many muscles in your brain that I hadn't exercised in years. And it was like, oh, it's a blank slate. Like I can't pull from last year's, deck or last year's forecast. It's like we're just building from scratch. And so there was a lot of kind of like wake up moments that at the time felt a little bit daunting, but in hindsight, I was super kind of gracious that I got to go through that.
And it forces you to be resourceful. So I think in the corporate world, we're used to having a lot of resources. In the startup world, it's just all hands on deck, do whatever you need to do to get it done. And it's one of those things that it really just forces you to figure out a new way to do stuff, and it forces innovation. You don't have a choice, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And even in hindsight too, like I think the first 12 months, I felt like, wow, I'm moving so much faster than I had the last 10 years. But then after a year, you're like, oh, I actually wasn't moving fast enough. Like there's still opportunities to accelerate and really just prioritize, like what are the initiatives that are going to have the most impact the fastest.
Now, I want people to get some reality on exactly what you came from to what you went into, where a lot of people have heard the term actuarial. What actually does an actuarial do?
Yeah. Yeah. So the background for me was I was a math major undergrad. And so there was kind of this mindset back in 2002, 2006, 2007 of like, are you going to be a math teacher? And I was like, I don't want to do that. Maybe someday, because I do enjoy teaching, but not right out of college.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you Google like jobs for a math major, actuary tends to be kind of the top of the list. So I knew nothing about it, to be honest. And then you have to take actuarial exams. So you're taking, probability and financial modeling, and it's all kind of numbers driven exams. At the end of the day, an actuary is trying to project some kind of risk. They're trying to forecast something. And so for me, I was in the health and benefits line of business within consulting. And the way I try to sum it up is, a CHRO might come to our company and say, we spent $50 million on healthcare last year across our employees. What do you think we're going to spend next year? And so the actuaries kind of take all the data from the last few years and project that spend. And we might say, it looks like it's going to be 57 million next year. And they say, oh, we only have 54 million. So what are the things we can adjust from a programmatic perspective, from an insurance coverage perspective to get them in budget? And so the forecast part, it was interesting to me, but at the end of the day, the strategy to actually hit the goal was the more important part. So I always joked with people that the more exams I started passing, the more boring for me that my job was getting. And so I actually like the exam part, but then I'm getting rewarded with things that I don't enjoy as much. And so about 2 or 3 years in, I pivoted to more the strategy side.
Yeah, which especially if you've kind of got that entrepreneur streak is a lot more better than being what I refer to as actuaries as the hardcore data nerds.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of Excel spreadsheets, not a lot of people.
Exactly. Yes, true story. It's a part of business that I think we really need. It's very, very necessary, especially in insurance industries. It's, any insurance, car, life, whatever, but it's something that a lot of people don't think about. So you came from this really structured, very much data-driven, mathematical, predictable thing to startup, which is none of those. The forecast is sort of like, well, let's pull out the dartboard and see what our target is for next year.
Yeah,
There's a random number generator when we need it. Yeah. Maybe not that bad, but I just wanted people to understand exactly. It was a change, and I'm assuming it took a while. What did you do during those first couple of months to kind of just to deal with a complete change in style? Because it sounds like it was eventually a good thing, but transition, Yeah.
I think I think I had a little bit of a blessing, I think, to be in business school at the time of the change, because it was almost like there was so much change happening in my world. And so I was learning Monday through Friday about being at a 15-person startup. I was also learning on the weekends in business school. And so my mind was just on overdrive of like trying to unlearn everything that I had learned over the last 10 years, understand which parts were still applicable, understand which parts were just no longer relevant at all. And I think it was just drinking from a fire hose and not having the time to realize it was that big of a change. The other thing I would say is, because of my role in terms of meeting all those other entrepreneurs, I would really call it a small glimpse of what it felt like, which didn't actually help me as much, but I had a nice network of people where I could tap into. And go get coffee with or hop on a call with and just say like, hey, we're running into this. And they can just say like, that's totally normal. We went through that same thing 3 years ago. And so I had a bunch of just kind of people resources that made a lot of those things that in the moment felt stressful completely normalized, and it made it a lot easier to just kind of move through those motions.
And so I know you went to Sloan School of Management, which is one of the top management schools in the world, and part of MIT. And how one of the things we see with like startups is a startup culture, and a way you run a startup is very, very different than a way you run a larger corporation. And I think a lot of times in business school we learn larger corporation. What was were you how were you able to apply what you learned in your MBA to kind of the startup culture, which is a little bit different? Or was there a correlation there, or was it just totally different skill set? Or how did you work that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think I realized that Sloan had really differentiated itself amongst other business schools around being more of an innovative kind of early stage startup type of curriculum. Of course, it applies to larger corporates, but a big part of their mission and angle is kind of the startup world. So a lot of the classes you could take were like entrepreneurial strategy and like pricing for the first time and things like that became incredibly relevant. There's some stat, I never remember the number because no matter what number I say, it always doesn't feel like it's accurate. But there's some statistic that's like 90,000 companies right now are currently active that were founded by Sloan alum. Like it's a massive number. And I just didn't know that going into it. So I, again, feel fortunate that once I started the program, there were kind of the corporate finance, accounting, classes that, again, they're still applicable to startups, but there was a ton of just startup specific content that was even more relevant.
Which I think is really great, because when I was getting a business degree, they taught us about like, contingent workforces and stuff like that, but you didn't get a lot of the people who are our professors were active entrepreneurs, but there wasn't a whole lot of that in the coursework. So you just got it as part of, the professor understanding that difference and being able to correlate it, but it wasn't heavily influenced by entrepreneurs. So I love the fact that Sloan is doing that, especially being, this top school. It seems like it makes sense that MIT would be doing this, but it's nice because I think that's really the future, is a lot more startups, a lot more smaller businesses, a lot more, coming in and coalescing together towards a goal. And so it's nice to hear that. I'm glad to hear that you guys, that MIT is thinking about entrepreneurs and helping them with startups. Yes, that's always good. Because again,
Yeah.
very, very different, different world.
And I say this all the time. I think there's not a single class I took at school that I'm not using today. Sometimes I forget that it's like, oh, this actually came from that conversation, et cetera. The other thing I also say is once we started Electives, so my co-founder was a classmate at Sloan, and there's so much you can read and talk about in class, and then the moment you just start doing it, it's always a little bit different. And so as helpful as the coursework was, I mean, you learn so much faster by just jumping in, head first and doing. So it's been a good combination.
Interesting. So now you moved on to starting another company called Electives, and this one I have a personal relation with, just because having been in online learning for a long time, I always love to see the new technologies out there. There's some cool stuff like on the true like online learning side of things that most people don't see, not like school or Canva or that. There's like adaptive learning. There's weird statistical models we use to show if somebody's actually cheating on a test. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff. Tell me a little bit more about Electives and what it does. Kind of curious.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll kind of share why we started the company and then segue into what it does. So um, basically there was a moment, probably summer of 2020. I basically had a really bad corporate training experience. So I forget the name of the solution, which is probably a good thing because I tell the story quite a bit. But I remember when they were rolling it out to a group of about 100 of us. The account executive said, we have a new product feature that we're really excited about, rolling out this year. And I remember feeling really excited to hear what that was. And when they revealed it, the new feature was they disabled the fast forward button on the videos. And so my first reaction was like, that is not the problem that we should be solving. And so we all went through it. We clicked through the videos. We kind of checked the box. We took the quizzes, but there really was no learning. There was no connection with your peers. It was really just kind of going through the motions. And so I didn't think too much of it other than at dinner that night, my wife and I kind of joked over dinner. We were like, we just had never really had a good corporate training. Like we had both respectively only worked at two different companies, but you learn by doing a ton of stuff, but as a standalone training, we just didn't feel like we had access to really good training. And so had that conversation, didn't think much of it. And then 2 days later at school, we had two different guest lectures come into our program kind of as a surprise. So one was a historian, and then the second was a mountaineer who was teaching. I think he led 7 expeditions up Mount Everest, which I had no idea, how challenging and grueling that actually was. But he was teaching decision-making frameworks for teams, particularly teams under crisis. And it was only 60 minutes, but it was just this incredible learning experience. Like the storytelling, the imagery that he used, the framework was so relevant to no matter what industry we as students were all coming from. And so by the end of that session, I remember it happened to be like family weekend at school, and like everyone was just buzzing around campus telling their significant others and their parents and their siblings how great the morning of learning was. And it kind of caused a classmate and I, who's now my co-founder, to basically ask this question of like, imagine if corporate training felt like that. Like you just didn't want it to end. You couldn't wait for the next session. Like there was that level of enthusiasm. And Krikor and I just became more and more excited about that idea, and we really couldn't stop thinking about it. And so fast forward months and months later, we ended up interviewing, probably 100+ chief people officers and heads of learning and development and HR leaders, and just tried to understand kind of the lay of the land as far as L&D, in 2020. And it was interesting, even though I came from a decade of HR consulting, it was always benefits. So I was so close to L&D, but I just never got the exposure at the business level. I certainly felt it as an employee. Yeah. And across all those conversations, I would say the two things that kind of thematically stood out across every one of them was, number one, and this is fall of 2020. Yeah. One was, it felt like the pendulum had swung so far into pre-recorded content. And so a lot of companies said like, we offer LinkedIn Learning or we offer XYZ, but no one's engaging in those videos. And so they were like, how do we make live virtual learning just easier, more accessible, like just an easier way to roll out? So that was one theme that was interesting to us. And then the second was, we started asking everybody, like, how do you find a good corporate trainer? Like, if you want to go through this process, whether it's sales training, manager training, DEI training, whatever the case may be, how do you find those people? And what was interesting was, one, everybody said it's really hard. They were like, there's no Expedia.com for like every trainer with ratings and reviews and things that you can kind of discover to see who's a good fit. The other thing that was interesting was everyone's behavior was like, I want to find a corporate trainer for my managers, or I want to find a corporate trainer to teach sales. And there's no doubt there is a really good group of corporate trainers who exist in the world who could teach. The thing that was interesting to us was we started to reflect on like the mountaineer and the historian, and we're like, those two people don't have the term corporate trainer in their profile, but they're really good instructors and educators of adults. So how many other people are being missed in this learning opportunity? And so those two things of making live learning easier and kind of redefining or just broadening the definition of who could teach in the workplace became super interesting to us. And so, end of 2020, early 2021, we launched the company. We named the company Electives because we're like, those are the classes in school you like couldn't wait to take. And so we're like, we want corporate training to feel like. And now fast forward, 3.5 years later, we're kind of like following those two North Stars. We provide live virtual training to companies. There's 500+ classes on the platform. And there's this interesting opportunity for employees to learn from a lot of different people. They can learn from startup founders, they can learn from FBI agents, they can learn from Olympic athletes, they can learn from high school principals. Like the definition of who a trainer has broadened. Number one thing that's most important to us is the instructor a really good instructor. And if employees get excited, if they're learning, if they want more of it, that's a signal for us that that's a good instructor.
And that's something that I've seen, again, 20 years, I've seen over the years, because I started off as a corporate trainer, and some were very good, some were not. It just depended on who you had, and it was very management driven. And so it was more about what the managers wanted to see a checkbox check versus actually engaged training. I've had a lot of really bad training experiences, not because I was a bad trainer, because I was given this kind of steaming pile and said, "Here, deal."
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I had a story about an FDA compliance training that I had to give that was just really awful. And it was kind of a turning point in my life, going, I don't ever want to commit this level of academic assault again, which is essentially what it turned into. But, I love the fact that you're disrupting that and changing it. And you're right. There are some people that are really good trainers, some that are not. Trying to find a good corporate trainer is somewhat difficult. Somebody that's really engaging and that knows their subject matter. I think that's the other side of it too, is that oftentimes as trainers, we knew our subject matter really well. We kind of turned into an SME or subject matter expert just because we did. But being able to pull from folks who are also in the industry who can give. So as corporate trainers, we were generally really good at giving the theory side of things. Often we had experience in the industry too, but not as much as somebody, like you said, a high school principal coming in and giving their specific, the theoretical discussion, and then coming in and also giving here's how it really works. Like you said, about going into a startup situation where you're like, well, here's how here's what we were taught, and here's how it really works. There's a big difference there sometimes. Learning from experience and using that experience towards it. So that sounds really cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there was something interesting in the early days. We realized how often people learn from kind of similar experts. So like when I reflected on my own experience, when I was in healthcare, anytime we brought in corporate trainers, it was typically folks who had healthcare experience. And that makes sense. So, you want to learn from people within your industry. But there was never really this opportunity to kind of learn from a different industry and pull those insights into your own. And the term that we started using was cross-training. And both Krikor and I were reflecting early days. We were like, that term cross-training, gets used quite a bit in physical development. Like if I am trying to become a better cyclist, I got to go on runs and do squats and do things that aren't just ride a bike every day. But for professional development, it was always like accountants go to accounting training, salespeople go to sales training. You learn from people in your own industry. And we wanted to start kind of bringing in this opportunity to learn from an astronaut on a Thursday and like get a little bit of exposure to somebody outside of your quote 9 to 5. And that's where we believe the magic happens. And I think you not only get more engaged in the actual session, there's so much more inspiration to then continue that learning. It's like, what did that person recommend in terms of the TED Talk or the book that they recommend? Like now I want to go follow a little bit more of that person's journey. So I do think there's a pretty big, powerful component of just like learning from outside your, daily orbit, if you will.
Exactly. Because, things, so I mainly focused on finance and healthcare, and was what I did as a corporate trainer. I had a couple of other clients too, but it was funny, the couple of other side clients, like one was a directory system. I was able to pull some of that in, and I know exactly what you're talking about, being able to do the different learning modalities and kind of just come in. Sometimes as healthcare, we think differently than finance, but we can use some of those, techniques in finance, and it's a better way to look at it. Sometimes we get caught in our own little worlds, and it gets us outside of it. So that's awesome, man. That's cool. So now, as far as electives, just a couple I'm kind of curious of now, is it more for like large companies, small companies, end users? Like what is its target market?
Yeah. So the target market in the early days, and it's still early days, it's only been 3.5 years, but we focused on kind of I'd call it like 50 to 500 employee size company where we use the expression like really lean people team. So they have a people team of 1 or 2. They may or may not even have a learning and development function in-house. And so they're growing the business. Their employees are naturally craving, professional development, but they just don't have an in-house team that can, deliver on that. And so the expression we often use is we help companies do content curation instead of content creation. So we're not helping kind of build your own content. We're tapping into experts who already have their own. What's interesting as we've evolved is it turns out there's a lot of enterprise companies that also have really lean people teams. And so, even if the company has, 30,000 employees, they reach out and they're like, yeah, we're an HR team of 4. And like, we don't have the bandwidth to teach manager training and leadership development and help our ICs, et cetera. So interestingly for us, that lean people team has kind of been pretty common across size of company. But for the most part, it tends to be that smaller growing company that just can't keep pace with all of the demands in a good way that employees are requesting from a content perspective.
And a lot of times companies are going to places like Udemy and other places, other sites where the content is very hit or miss. I've seen some really good Udemy courses, seen some really bad Udemy courses used in corporate training, but it's just because they don't have the bandwidth or the ability to be able to hire a full-time learning and development team, which is expensive. So it's nice to have that kind of gap in the middle. And I like how you said curated, because it's, you're talking to experts. This isn't just some random Joe, it's somebody who, the provenance of the training that's being done, that somebody that's there that really knows what they're talking about, which is a huge, from what I've seen in the industry, a huge gap. Like it's just, let's just throw some training together and say that we did it because of compliance reasons versus kind of being a little bit more mindful of what you're doing. So I like that a lot.
Yeah. That feeling of like one size never fits all couldn't be more relevant in training. It's like, even within one organization, we hear feedback of like this group of sales team members loves breakout rooms. They love interaction. The chat's blowing up. Like, we want a really highly interactive class. And then it's like that same company, a different group of people is like, they don't like breakout rooms. They like to sit back. They like the theory. And so we have multiple instructors who teach the same content, but knowing kind of who's going to be a good cultural fit, depending on the audience, goes such a long way. And even just mixing up who that person is, because even in a class of 40, not every person's going to, connect with that person. And we understand that. And so if we can mix that level of engagement, that instructor, it just goes a long way from a learning perspective.
And it can help too, especially in courses that depending on regulations have to be taught, like FDA's CGMP training, which is what all pharmaceutical manufacturers have to go through it every year. It's legally required. It is adult training, and to have other people, have somebody to be able to match. I've given that training more often than I actually want to admit to, because it's bad. But having the different types of trainers come in and do that, depending on the corporate culture, really helps a lot with that. Cool, man.
Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. We're wrapping up just a little bit. I do have one question that I ask everyone, and that is, what is one book or podcast that has had a significant impact on your life?
That is a great question. There's probably too many to list. The one that comes to mind, which I actually haven't thought about in a while, but a mentor probably like a dozen years ago had recommended Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. And it's this great kind of foundational book on behavioral economics. And I remember at the time, and I feel like I adjusted too far in this. So like that book was recommended to me, and I think ever since I've only ever read nonfiction, which I need to like kind of go back and bring some novels and fiction back into my life. But that book was so powerful from just a psychology of human behavior lens of talking about anchors and decoys and loss aversion and just so many things that we all deal with all the time, both personally and professionally. But more importantly, it just lit this like desire to continue kind of reading about, I'll broadly say like self-help / business books, because that's pretty much all I touch now. And then the only other one that comes to mind immediately is about 2 years ago, I read Danny Meyer's Setting the Table. And that's all lessons from hospitality in business. And there's so many kind of sayings and expressions and lessons learned from that book that I continuously think about myself and share with our team quite a bit. So those two stand out to, but the list is quite long.
Understood. Yeah, I think that's something I see a lot in entrepreneurs, is that we don't know what nonfiction books are because we're just reading whatever's going to help us take the needle forward. And I think that's a major transition that happens between like 9 to 5 or to entrepreneurs. We all make that transition. So I feel you. I know where you're at. So
absolutely.
Jason, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, Andrew, so good to chat with you, and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care.
You too. Thanks again for joining us on the Hustle and Grind podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Jason, check out the link in the description.